The judge smiled when Lydia walked in. Not a warm smile, not a welcoming one. The kind of smile a man gives when he's already decided the outcome and finds the whole thing mildly amusing. He looked at her, 23 years old, natural hair pulled back, wearing a blazer she'd borrowed from her cousin because she didn't own one, and he smiled like she was a child who had wandered into the wrong room. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. She set her folder down on the table and pulled out the chair for her grandmother, and she sat down next to her, and she waited. That's the part nobody talks about, not the win, the waiting. The way Lydia Tate sat in that courtroom in Harlan County and absorbed every smirk, every whispered comment, every raised eyebrow from the other side of the aisle, and did not move a single muscle in her face. But we'll get to that. You have to understand where Lydia came from before you can understand what she did. Lydia Tate had lived in the same house for 41 years, a white clapboard house on the edge of a road that used to be called Mill Creek Road before the county renamed it after a developer who donated money to the right people. The house had a front porch with a swing that needed a new chain. It had a kitchen that smelled like cornbread and cast iron. It had a bedroom in the back where Thelma had slept, next to her husband Calvin for 33 years before a stroke took him one Tuesday morning in March. After Calvin died, Thelma was alone. But she wasn't without. She had the house. She had the land, 4 acres, which isn't much by some people's measure but is everything by others. She had a garden she kept herself until her knees got bad. She had neighbors who waved when they drove by. She had a church she went to every Sunday, and a pew where they still put her name on a little paper card, even though she hadn't been able to make it in 8 months. And she had Lydia. Lydia was Thelma's granddaughter through her son Marcus, who worked offshore oil in Louisiana and sent money when he could and called on Sundays when he remembered. Lydia had grown up 2 hours away in Decatur, but she'd spent every summer in that white clapboard house. She knew which step on the porch creaked. She knew that the back door stuck in humidity and you had to lift it slightly while you turned the knob. She knew that Thelma kept her important papers in a metal box under the bed on the left side, the side that had been Calvin's, because Thelma said Calvin had always been the careful one, and some habits outlast the people who taught them to you. Lydia had done 2 years in the Army before a knee injury ended her service. Not combat, logistics, which people always underestimate. You learn to read situations. You learn to find the problem before it finds you. You learn that paperwork matters more than people think it does, and that the details nobody wants to look at are usually exactly where the trouble is hiding. She was working as a security supervisor at a distribution center in Decatur when her grandmother called. Thelma's voice was different. Not scared. Thelma didn't scare easy, but careful, like she was choosing every word before she let it out. She said a man had come to the house, said his name was Phillip Crane, said he was from a property management company, said he had documents. Lydia asked what kind of documents. Thelma was quiet for a moment. She said, "Baby, he says I signed something, and I don't remember signing anything." Lydia drove down that same night. She didn't tell her grandmother she was coming, because she knew Thelma would say, "Don't bother, it's late, wait until morning." Lydia didn't want to wait until morning. Something in her chest had gone tight the way it used to before Convoy moved out, and she had learned a long time ago not to ignore that feeling. She got there at 11:15. The porch light was on. Thelma was still awake, sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea she hadn't touched, the metal box open on the table in front of her. She looked smaller than Lydia remembered, or maybe Lydia had just forgotten, in the months since she'd visited, how much age had settled into her grandmother's shoulders. Thelma was 74. She was sharp, sharper than most people half her age. But her body had started making negotiations that her mind wasn't ready to accept. Lydia sat down across from her and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Show me." Thelma slid a paper across the table. It was a photocopy, blurry in the way that suggested it had been copied from a copy, and at the bottom was a signature that said Thelma R. Tate in looping cursive. Lydia looked at it for a long time. She looked at her grandmother. She said, "Is this your signature?" Dilma said, "That's what my signature looks like. But I didn't sign this. I didn't sign anything with this man's company. I've never heard of this company." Lydia asked when the document was dated. Dilma pointed, March 14th. Lydia looked up. "Grandma, that was 2 weeks after your hip surgery." Dilma nodded slowly. She said, "I know." The company was called Crane and Halloran Property Solutions. Lydia spent 3 hours that night looking them up on her phone while Thelma slept. She found a business registration in the county from 14 months ago. She found 2 reviews on a site nobody really uses, both 5 stars, both written in the same, slightly too formal English. She found no physical office address, just a P.O. box. She found a man named Phillip Crane, listed as principal, and another named Brock Halloran, listed as registered agent. She found, buried in a county recorder database that took her 40 minutes to navigate, a deed transfer. 4 acres, White Clapboard House on what used to be Mill Creek Road. Transferred to Crane and Halloran Property Solutions. Dated March 14th. 2 weeks after her grandmother's hip surgery, when Thelma had been on painkillers strong enough to make her sign her own name twice and not remember it. Lydia sat in the kitchen of her grandmother's house at 2 in the morning and looked at that document on her phone screen and felt something cold move through her. Not panic. She wasn't built for panic. But something clear and certain that said, "This is real, and it is bad, and you are the only person in the world right now who is going to do anything about it." She called 3 lawyers the next morning. The first said he didn't handle property disputes. The second said he could take a look, but his retainer was $4,000. The third said the same thing, different number. Lydia's savings account had $1,100 in it. She had a car payment due in 2 weeks. She did the math the way soldiers do, not with hope, but with clarity, and the numbers did not work. She called legal aid. They were understaffed and their next available appointment was 6 weeks out. She called the county clerk's office. They said she'd need to contest the transfer in court and would she like the number for the civil filing desk. She called her father Marcus in Louisiana. He said he'd try to send something, but he was between rotation cycles and money was tight. And also, had she talked to a lawyer? She had talked to a lawyer. Several, in fact. Nobody was coming. That's the thing nobody in Harlan County wanted to acknowledge, but Lydia had understood it the moment she saw the look on the county clerk's face when she explained the situation. Nobody was coming. Not because they didn't believe her. Maybe some of them did. But because Thelma Tate was an old black woman with no money and no connections, and a deed transfer that had already been processed and filed. And those things have a way of making problems disappear into paperwork until the people attached to them give up or die. Lydia was not going to give up. And her grandmother was not going to die in someone else's house. She filed the contest herself. It took her 11 days. 11 days of reading every statute she could find online, every precedent, every legal guide written in plain enough English that she could follow the thread. She drove to the county library and asked the reference librarian, a woman named Vera Solomon, who had a wall of law dictionaries behind her desk and the patience of someone who had seen everything, for help finding the right databases. Vera didn't ask questions. She just pointed Lydia to the right shelf and left a yellow notepad on the table. Lydia filled 4 of them. She learned about undue influence. She learned about capacity, legal capacity. Specifically, the standard for whether a person is competent to sign a binding document. She learned that there is a principle in contract law, boring and procedural on its face, that says a signature obtained during a period of documented medical incapacitation may be challenged as voidable. Thelma had been hospitalized from March 1st through March 19th. The surgery was on March 3rd. The signature was dated March 14th. 11 days after surgery. Still inpatient. Still on a medication regimen that the discharge summary, which Lydia requested from the hospital with a simple written form, listed as including a sedative and a painkiller with documented effects on cognitive function. She had the discharge summary. She had the medication list. She had Thelma's hospital admission records showing she had been a patient on March 14th. And she had one more thing. She had the signature itself. Lydia's grandmother had signed her name the same way for decades. Thelma had shown her once, as a child, pressing her hand over Lydia's to guide the pen. The capital T had a specific curl. The R in the middle had a loop that dipped below the line. Thelma's signature was not something you could copy casually. It had quirks. It had age in it. The signature on the deed transfer did not have those quirks. It was close. It was very close. But the R sat above the line, and the T's curl went right instead of left. Lydia put both signatures side by side under the light in Thelma's kitchen. She took a photograph with her phone. She took 12 photographs from different angles at different zoom levels. Then she filed the contestation in civil court, listed herself as Thelma's designated representative, paid the filing fee with the last of her savings, and waited for a hearing date. The hearing date came back as 3 weeks out. Phillip Crane sent a lawyer. Of course he did. His name was Reid, and he had been practicing in Harlan County for 22 years, and he wore a suit that fit the way suits fit when someone has had them made. He walked into the courtroom like he belonged there the way furniture belongs in a room, not aggressive about it, just settled, at ease. He smiled at the clerk. He knew the bailiff's name. He looked at Lydia when she came in, and his expression didn't change exactly, but something shifted behind his eyes, a kind of recalibration. She was younger than he'd expected, probably. She was not a lawyer. That was clear from her filing, which had the correct information but not the correct formatting. She had a folder instead of a briefcase. She was wearing her cousin's blazer. The judge's name was the Honorable Reid. He had been on the bench for 17 years. He looked at Lydia the way Reid had probably looked at a lot of things in 17 years, with the settled confidence of a man who has already formed his opinion and is simply waiting for the proceedings to confirm it. When Lydia stated her name and her role, Reid smiled. Not warmly. Reid introduced himself, and the room seemed to exhale slightly, like a body recognizing something familiar. The judge asked Lydia if she understood the nature of civil proceedings. She said she did. He asked if she had legal representation. She said she was representing her grandmother directly, as designated representative, under the relevant statute, which she named by number. He paused. Then he said, "All right, let's proceed." Reid went first. He was good. Lydia had expected him to be good, and he was. He presented the deed transfer. He presented Crane's testimony about the signing. That Phillip Crane had visited Thelma at home on March 14th, that Thelma had been present and lucid, that she had reviewed the documents and signed them willingly in exchange for a payment of $1,200, which Crane claimed to have paid in cash. $1,200 for 4 acres of land, for the house Thelma had lived in for 41 years. Lydia wrote 3 words in her notepad: cash, no receipt. Then Reid made a small mistake, not a big one, just a crack. He said with that settled smile that the signature on the document was clearly and obviously authentic, and that the contestation being brought today was a family member's understandable but ultimately unfounded emotional reaction to a legally binding transaction. Understandable but unfounded. Lydia wrote that down too. When it was her turn, she stood up straight. She presented the hospital records first. She laid them on the table in front of the judge. Admission records, surgical notes, medication logs, and she said in a clear and even voice that on March 14th, the date of the alleged signing, Thelma Tate had been an inpatient at Harlan County General Hospital, that she had been under documented medication that had a listed effect on cognitive function, that no visitor log entry existed at the hospital showing Phillip Crane had visited Thelma on that date, that the hospital had no record of any external signing ceremony or notarized document execution in a patient room. The judge looked at the records. Reid's face did not change, but he was very still. Then Lydia put the 2 signatures on the table. She had printed them, side by side, enlarged, on a single sheet of paper. She said, "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to these 2 signatures." She pointed to the first one, Thelma's actual signature, taken from a document Thelma had signed before her surgery, dated and verified. Then she pointed to the second one, the signature on the deed transfer. She said, "I am not a handwriting expert. I want to be clear about that. But I would like to ask the court one question." She paused. She looked at the judge. She said, "If Mr. Crane visited my grandmother in her hospital room on March 14th to obtain this signature, a visit the hospital has no record of. Could he explain why the signature on this deed doesn't match the signature my grandmother has used for the past 40 years in every document I've been able to locate? The room was quiet. Garrett Voss cleared his throat. Reid Dunmore looked at the two signatures for a long time, long enough that the room started to feel it. The kind of silence that means something has shifted. Then he looked at Garrett Voss. He said, "Counsel, does your client have a response to the hospital's documentation showing Mrs. Tate was an inpatient on the date of the alleged signing?" Garrett Voss said he would need time to review the records. The judge said that was interesting, given that Voss had just represented the signing as clearly and obviously authentic. Voss said he'd been relying on his client's account. The judge said, "Yes, I imagine you were." The hearing was continued for 30 days to allow for forensic handwriting analysis, which the court ordered at the court's own expense. The analysis came back 26 days later. The report said, in the precise and bloodless language of expert documents, that the signature on the deed transfer showed significant inconsistencies with the authenticated reference signatures provided by the respondent, and that these inconsistencies were not consistent with normal variations in an individual signature over time, but were instead consistent with signature reproduction by a third party. Consistent with signature reproduction by a third party. Lydia read that sentence 3 times. She was sitting at Thelma's kitchen table when she read it. The same table where she'd sat at 2 in the morning 4 weeks earlier, with a cup of cold coffee and a photograph on her phone and the weight of something she couldn't name pressing on her chest. She set her phone down. She put her face in her hands. Not because she was falling apart. She wasn't. She was putting her face in her hands because sometimes, when you had been holding something that heavy for that long, you need to give yourself 10 seconds to be something other than steady. 10 seconds. Then she picked her phone back up and called her grandmother. The final hearing was 2 weeks after the report. Phillip Crane did not appear. His attorney, no longer Garrett Voss, who had withdrawn from the case with a filing that contained no explanation, was a younger associate from a firm in the next county who looked like she had been handed the case that morning and had done her best. She did not do well enough. Reid Dunmore voided the deed transfer. He did it in 3 sentences. He found that the document had been executed under circumstances that rendered it void, that the alleged signing took place while the signatory was hospitalized and under documented medical incapacitation, that the signature itself showed forensic evidence of reproduction by a third party, and that no credible evidence had been offered to rebut either finding. 3 sentences. 41 years of Thelma Tate's life were stored in 3 sentences. Outside the courthouse, in the parking lot that smelled like old asphalt in early summer, Thelma sat in her wheelchair and held Lydia's hand and didn't say anything for a while. The sun was coming through the trees at the edge of the lot. A bird was doing something persistent in one of them. Then Thelma said, "Your grandfather would have something to say about this." Lydia asked what he would say. Thelma thought about it. Then she said, "He'd say we need to go home and eat something because you can't celebrate on an empty stomach." Lydia laughed. It came out louder than she expected, the kind of laugh that surprises you because it's carrying more than just the moment. It's carrying all the moments before it, the hard ones, the cold 2 a.m. ones, the ones where the number in the savings account didn't add up and nobody was coming, and the only option was to keep reading. She pushed her grandmother toward the car. Phillip Crane was referred to the county district attorney's office for investigation into deed fraud. That referral became a formal inquiry 6 weeks later. The details of that process are still ongoing as of the time the story is being told, but the DA's office confirmed in a brief public statement that the investigation was active and that Crane and Halloran Property Solutions had been the subject of at least 2 prior complaints in neighboring counties that had not resulted in action. 2 prior complaints. That means there were other Thelmas, other white-clappered houses, other signatures that didn't belong to the people they claimed to. Whether those families got their houses back is a question this story cannot answer. Some of them probably didn't. Some of them probably gave up when the lawyer's retainer was $4,000 and their savings account had $1,100 in it, and nobody was coming. That's not a failure of character. That's just mathematics, and the mathematics of who gets protected in a place like Harlan County have never been distributed equally. But Thelma Tate got her house back. And the person who got it back for her was a 23-year-old woman with a borrowed blazer and a notepad from the library, and the particular kind of stubbornness that comes from having been trained to find the problem before it finds you. Lydia stayed in Harlan County for another 3 weeks after the hearing. She helped Thelma fix the chain on the porch swing. She repainted the front steps, which had been peeling since before Calvin died. She cooked. She watched television in the evenings with her grandmother and let herself be the child in the room again for a little while. Before she left, she went through Thelma's metal box with her. Not to manage it. She had tried that once, and Thelma had given her a look that made clear some things were not to be managed, but to make sure everything that needed to be in order was. She found Calvin's discharge papers from the army, folded into a square. She found Thelma and Calvin's original deed to the property, the real one, the 1983 one, filed properly and notarized by a man whose signature she could barely read. She found Marcus's birth certificate and her own mother's. She found a photograph she had never seen before of Thelma as a young woman, maybe 30, standing in front of the house when it had just been painted, squinting slightly in the sun, one hand raised like she was blocking the light. Lydia held that photograph for a long time. Then she put everything back in the metal box, closed the lid, and slid it under the left side of the bed. Calvin's side. The careful one. People ask what Lydia did was so remarkable. They want a technique. They want a strategy they can write down. They want the one question, the moment in the courtroom, the 2 signatures on the table, as if that was the thing. The question wasn't the thing. The question was the last inch of 11 days in the library and 41 years of a woman's life and a 2 a.m. moment in a kitchen when nobody was coming and the only move was forward. You cannot underestimate someone who has already decided that losing is not an option, not because of what they might know, not because of what training they might have, but because of what training they might have, but because of the specific quality of their attention, the way they will sit in a courtroom and absorb every smirk and every raised eyebrow and every understandable but unfounded, and not move a muscle, not because they're calm, but because they are saving every single bit of energy for exactly the right moment. And when that moment came, Lydia Tate put 2 pieces of paper on a table and asked one question, and the room heard the silence that followed. And that silence was the answer. I keep thinking about the metal box. The one Thelma kept under the left side of the bed, Calvin's side, because he had always been the careful one. Inside it, a deed from 1983, birth certificates, a photograph of a young woman squinting in the sun in front of a house she had just finished painting, 41 years of a life, folded and stored in a tin box under a bed. And for a few weeks, all of it, the house, the land, the porch swing, the stuck back door, had been transferred to 2 men in a P.O. box who counted on the fact that nobody would look closely enough. They were almost right. What I take from Lydia's story isn't the courtroom moment. It isn't the 2 signatures on the table or the judge's silence or the 3-sentence ruling. Those things happened because of everything that came before them, because of 11 days in a library, because of a notepad filled with statute numbers, because of a woman who looked at a math problem that didn't add up, no money, no lawyer, no one coming, and decided that the only variable she could control was her own attention. That's what I think about when people ask what it takes to fight back against something bigger than you. They want a technique. I don't think it's a technique. I think it's 3 things that don't get talked about together enough. The first is the decision to act honestly, not just legally, but in the fullest sense. Lydia didn't exaggerate. She didn't manufacture evidence. She said plainly in front of a judge who had already formed his opinion, "I am not a handwriting expert. I want to be clear about that." That honesty was not weakness. It was the thing that made everything else credible. When you tell the truth about what you don't know, people trust you about what you do know. Phillip Crane built his scheme on a lie, and it collapsed the moment someone asked one honest question. The second is the discipline to think clearly when emotion has every right to take over. Thoma's house, 41 years. A signature forged while an old woman was sedated in a hospital bed. I would have been furious. I probably would have walked into that courtroom furious, and it would have cost me. Lydia absorbed every smirk, every understandable but unfounded, and she saved the energy she had learned from the army, from logistics, from the specific education of being someone the system doesn't automatically protect. That clarity is more useful than anger. She read statutes instead of venting. She took 12 photographs of a signature instead of posting about it online. She thought before she acted, and then she acted exactly right. The third is the refusal to stop. Not stubbornness for its own sake, the kind that ignores new information, but the deeper thing. The thing that kept Lydia in that library chair when the savings account was empty and the legal aid line had a 6-week wait and her father said he'd try to send something. The belief that the outcome was not yet decided, that the last inch of a fight is as real as the first. Delma got her house back. The deed from 1983 went back in the metal box under Calvin's side of the bed. Those three things, the honesty to act with integrity, the discipline to think clearly under pressure, the refusal to accept that the story is over, they don't guarantee anything. I want to be honest about that too. Some people do everything right and still lose because the system was designed with different people in mind. But I know this. The people who built that system were counting on the fact that Lydia would do the math and stop. She didn't stop, and the rest followed from that.